I'm standing up, so you know that means something big is about to happen. All right, it's a very close race. It's a very, very close race. One of the consequences of it being so very close right now is that it is entirely possible that at the end of all of this, the President of the United States is going to be John Boehner. I am not kidding. Here's how this works, okay? The process by which that could happen is not that hard to understand, and it really could feasibly happen. Okay, here goes. This is the battleground map, right? The yellow states. The states that are already colored in red or blue are colored in that way because it seems clear that that is the way that state's going to vote on Election Day. Red for Republican, blue for Democrat. So let's assume that there are not going to be any big surprises there in the non-battleground states, and the states that are already filled in red or blue will go the way we think they're going to go. That brings us to just the battlegrounds. Those are the states in yellow. So in this scenario, before we get to the battleground states, President Obama, just from adding up the blue states, has 237 electoral votes, and Mitt Romney, just from adding up the red states, has 191 electoral votes. That's even before we get to the battleground states in yellow. You got to get up to 270 to win, right? So let's say beyond the states he pretty much knows he's going to win, President Obama picks up Ohio. All important Ohio. Let's say he also wins New Hampshire. And let's say he wins the great state of Wisconsin. But let's say Mitt Romney wins all of the other battleground states on the map. And this is not that hard to imagine in terms of the current polling that's really close, right? So Romney would win Florida and North Carolina and Virginia and Colorado and Nevada, and what I like to think of as the Iowa part of Ohio. So if that happens, and that seems possible, right? If that happens on Election Day, a totally feasible scenario, look at what the electoral count is. That is a tie. 269 to 269. Neither of them is president in this circumstance. So how, in this circumstance, do we decide who wins the presidency? Jonathan Karl at ABC News spun this out the other day in print. We've been looking at it ever since. And it is from here that we get to the potential presidency of one John Boehner. It is not an accident, right, what would happen in the case of a 269 to 269 electoral college tie. This is not something that we'd have to make up on the spot. The founders actually talked overtly about what would be the right thing to do in a circumstance like this. And it turns out they thought the right thing to do is a very strange thing. So according to the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, if there is an electoral college tie, it's the House of Representatives who gets to choose who is the president. But they do not vote on who's going to be president the way they normally vote on things in the House. In that circumstance, when they're making that specific decision, each state just gets one vote per state. So no matter how many members of Congress there are from each state, no matter how big the state's population, each state gets an equal vote. Each state gets one vote. So in this scenario that got us to an electoral tie between President Obama and Mitt Romney, Mr. Romney actually wins more states. He wins 29 states to President Obama's 21 states, which means that if the House of Representatives voted in keeping with the way they voted for president, their population in those states, Mitt Romney would be elected president by the House of Representatives. I mean, that said, nobody can instruct the state congressional delegations exactly how to cast their ballots. There's no provision about that. They get to decide on their own. You think they'd vote the way their state voted, or maybe they'd vote in their own partisan interests and work it out in their own little mini democracies or something. But if they did that, the way that their states voted, this is who we'd end up with. What if we ended up with, instead, 25 states picking a President Romney and 25 states picking a President Obama? There is no tiebreaker in that case. You know who becomes president in that circumstance? Not President Obama, not Mitt Romney, but this guy, Speaker of the House John Boehner, which is amazing. That's who becomes president in the event of a 25-state tie. It's also very unlikely. What is more likely is even weirder than a President Boehner, though. The more likely outcome in our electoral college tie that got us here is that there'll be no tie in the House. Mitt Romney will be elected president in the House. But then what happens to the Senate? What happens to the vice presidential tie, right? If there's an electoral tie, it goes to the House of Representatives. We get President Romney. And Vice President Paul Ryan, actually not automatically. This is the amazing part, and it's on purpose. It's not some vestigial thing that nobody thought of that came up by accident. The founders came up with a plan for this. The vice presidency would be decided in the Senate after the presidency was decided in the House of Representatives. So it's kind of nuts, but look at how it works out. In the Senate, they would vote for vice president in a very straightforward way. One senator, one vote, 100 votes altogether. But we wouldn't be talking about our current Senate. We'd be talking about the Senate that we will have after the election. If it's a Republican majority in the Senate that's elected in a couple of weeks, presumably that Republican majority would pick the Republican vice president to go with the Republican president. They'd pick Paul Ryan. if there is a Democratic majority elected this fall in the Senate, that Senate would presumably pick Joe Biden for vice president, right? If the Senate is tied at 50-50, in that case, the sitting vice president is the tie-breaking vote, meaning Joe Biden would likely vote to make Joe Biden vice president again. So then we would have, through a duly considered overt process dictated by the Constitution of the United States, President Mitt Romney and Vice President Joe Biden together at once. That is a totally feasible prospect as an outcome for this election. Isn't this a great country? Now it's time for the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Have a great night.
The Rachel Maddow Show, weeknights at 9 Eastern on MSNBC.